Lawrence Neal here, and welcome back to highintensitybusiness.com. This is episode 303. Today's topic is largely going to be around, again, the MedX leg press. You can always see this as a part two to the MedX leg press episode I did with Luke Carlson. Today's guest is Tim Ryan, who returns to the podcast. Tim is currently owner and operator of Strong Life Personal Training in Barrington, Illinois. He has personally been involved with exercise for over 43 years and currently has over 37 years of professional work experience in the health and fitness field. Tim's experience includes serving as the fitness director of a large hospital-owned, medically based fitness center, owning and operating several different personal training businesses, and involvement in exercise equipment design, modification, and retrofitting of existing equipment, and full-scale restoration and refurbishing. Could really done with some of those skills recently, Tim. Tim has also spent many years conducting educational programs and teaching and mentoring exercise instructors. He holds a Bachelor of Science degree in exercise science from Northern Illinois University. He has earned a number of nationally recognized fitness and personal training certifications over the years, including health fitness instructor with the American College of Sports Medicine, ACSM, personal trainer with the American Council on Exercise, ACE, MedX medical exercise technician with the University of Florida, Center of Exercise Science, and the one people will be most impressed with probably, Master Super Slow instructor with the Super Slow Exercise Guild, or SSEG. I don't normally read full bios these days because they're obviously quite lengthy, but I really felt I needed to read yours because I think it's so impressive. And I think you're just one of the most experienced and skilled people in the high intensity training space, Tim. Welcome back to the podcast.
All right. Hi, Lawrence. Thank you for having me. And I really appreciate it.
You're most welcome. A pleasure is all mine. And really grateful for you coming back on. I was taking some time this morning to listen to episode 40, which we did, I want to say in 2016 or 2017, somewhere around then probably.
Yeah.
And it's funny in part because you spend the whole time trying to explain to me knee flexion, which I fail to recognize because we keep talking about hamstring training. And I keep saying to you, oh, but Tim, if I'm doing all these other exercises, surely I'm getting hamstring stimulation. You're like, yeah, but Lawrence, you're not doing knee flexion. And it's quite obvious that I have no idea what knee flexion is in that episode, which I thought was quite entertaining to listen back to. Hopefully I've learned something since then.
Yeah, definitely.
So I just wanted to firstly check in with you. Obviously last year has been probably the most challenging year for our colleagues, and I'm sure you had a lot of challenges yourself in your business. Tell us what you went through in your business there.
Well, I've had a unique couple of years, I guess, and particularly the last year. But to kind of bring you up to speed a little bit, I owned and operated a personal training business in another city in Illinois here for about 22 years. And I was approached by one of my wealthy clients who was very into the program and, very interested in, he's kind of an entrepreneur of sorts, and he was very interested in the business. And we had always kind of had some conversations about it. And he'd ask me questions and we'd bounce things off each other and things like that. But at some point, he approached me and said, hey, if you're ever interested in selling this business, I would have a high interest in it. I kind of thought about it. I wasn't ready, at the time or anything like that. But he kept pursuing me. And then, finally I said, well, if the price is right, yeah, I'd probably be interested. So one thing came to another, and he made me a very attractive offer that really, frankly, I thought was higher than what the business was actually worth. But and I told him that, and I said, honestly, I think you're overestimating this a little bit, and wow. And he said, well, I've studied it and I've looked into it and I've watched what goes on here and this and that, and I really think it's worth that. So don't worry about it. You let me worry about it, kind of a thing. So And we're not talking, millions of dollars where I'm going to, be wealthy and retire, but I'm just saying he was offering me more than I felt the business was worth. So at any rate, I decided to take him up on his offer, especially because my hangup was, because I wasn't going to be, suddenly independently wealthy and retire. I told him, I said, well, this is all great, but I need a job. I can't just sell you my business and then fritter away the money living off of because I don't have a job or something like that. So he then explained to me what his thoughts were, and he offered me to work for him. His big plan was he wanted to expand the business, grow it out to multiple locations, and he was very impressed with the equipment that I had in my facility and so forth, and the modifications and retrofits that I had done. So he said, hey, I would love to have you come along with me and, number one, train all the trainers and take them through programs and prepare them and teach them all of this, as well as, do the equipment. And, I'm going to need, with all these different facilities, I'm going to need all this equipment, and I want this customized equipment that you have. So anyway, it seemed like a dream come true because, I was going to not only have an attractive sale price, but I was going to have a job and be able to continue to do what I love to do. So we went through with that, and I spent the first year working for him, and very quickly realized that he had very unrealistic expectations, number one, but also that he was very disorganized and is one of these guys that can't get anything done. So as we went along, I did my job. I did the best I could. That first year, he has not to date opened any other facilities. It's been 2 years now, and he's still just with the existing facility that I sold him. And he has not really made any progress whatsoever. But as I worked for him for that year, I could see that I didn't think this was going to be a long-term viable option, because I started losing confidence that he was going to be successful in what he claimed he was, going to try to do. So towards the end of that first year working for him, I decided that, I said, okay, I'll continue to work for this guy, but I cannot, completely bank on having a long-term job with him. And if he goes down, if this project doesn't work out, I'm going to be left without a job. So I need a sort of a fallback plan. So I started considering, what else am I going to do? I looked at different options outside of the fitness field. I looked at, possibly getting into some sort of a franchise again in another field. But what I kept coming back to is my love of the fitness industry and all of my years of experience, and how strongly that I feel and how strongly I believe in everything that we do. And particularly, with all of the recent information that has come out concerning the immense value of strength training, far beyond building muscle or getting stronger or more fit, but all of the health benefits, the anti-aging benefits. I just kept coming back to this idea that I've got to stay in fitness, and I love being my own boss. I love owning a business. So I just decided, what, I'm going to open another facility. This is what I do. And so I began to pursue opening another facility, and I did have a non-compete clause with the new owner, and I had to go outside of the area a certain distance to be able to legally do something. So I did my research, and I looked into other affluent communities that would support something like this, and eventually settled on Barrington, Illinois, which is the whole Barrington area is sort of a northwest suburb of Chicago, very affluent area, and that's what I did. So to make a long story a little shorter, hopefully, I just got the business open, Strong Life Personal Training, at the start of 2020. All right. Literally like January 1st of 2020. And I had a number of things in place. I really tried to do everything right. I had some marketing and advertising in place and some networking things going on, and got off to a decent start, the first month or two, and things were rolling. And then, of course, the pandemic hit, and mid-March, our state of Illinois, the governor shut everything down and pretty much squashed all of my plans and everything that I was doing. And we were shut down for about 3 months. And I think everybody else knows, the rest of the history of the year. But obviously, it's been very difficult because even though we're now allowed to be open, people's attitude and psyche and safety levels and comfort levels or whatever are not the same as it was. Mm-hmm. So it's been, very difficult getting restarted and trying to grow the business after everything that's happened this year.
Mm. Yeah, so you're seeing, well, firstly, congratulations on the sale. I mean, that's an incredible achievement. And I really appreciate you being so transparent with everything. It's really interesting to hear about that. And you're saying that going into 2021, you're still seeing a fair amount of consumer fear. Can you give some examples? Like, are you having clients tell you, like, because I've seen your website's great, by the way. It's so clear. Your messaging and your copy is so clear about what you do and what makes you different. I love that. And you're very clear about the safety, about it's like, you say on the website, it's like having your own gym, right? It's one-on-one. Yeah. Beautiful studio, by the way. Was it 1,000 square feet? Something like that?
Actually, it's a little bigger, and it's about 2,500 square feet. And I wasn't initially looking for that much. I wasn't looking for that much space and didn't felt like I needed that much space, but the building and the facility that I found, the landlord was very interested in having me in there. And I kind of walked away from the deal several times because I felt it was, number one, more space than I needed. And I obviously didn't want to pay for any more space than I really needed. So I walked away a couple times, and he kept pursuing me and offering me a better deal on the rent and more attractive terms. So eventually it kind of became another one of these things where can't pass that up, and now that I have that amount of space, it is very nice. Gives me plenty of room in the exercise area, and a couple offices and some changing rooms, and a nice lobby waiting area space, and even a little kitchenette area for like an employee lounge or something like that. So it's worked out pretty good. It's a beautiful space, and right now I've got fairly attractive terms, but it kind of ramps up over the length of the lease. So it's given me an opportunity to have a relatively low rent to get started, but it is going to start increasing over the next couple of years. So definitely want to get the business going. But to answer your question with, people's fears or whatever, I think I'm dealing with a couple things. One, I moved into a completely new area where I had no contacts and no roots in the community. I didn't know anybody. I demographically, I was very familiar with the area, and I knew that income-wise and so forth, that the area could support personal training. But
do you mind if I ask, what do you look for in terms of like median income or average income in an area? I'm just curious.
Yeah, well, basically as high as possible. One of the things that I've really wanted to do, and that I've experienced in past years, but I really didn't want a situation where there was much objection to paying for personal training. So I didn't want to be fighting that. So I think the average income or the median income or something in this area is like $150,000 a year, $175,000 a year kind of average income or something. And it's similar to, it's probably a little higher than where I was previously, but very similar. So what I kind of did is I researched the demographics of all the well-known wealthy communities around the Chicago area, and looked at where those were in terms of income, and compare that to the, the areas that were viable to me to go to, because I needed to be somewhat close to where I lived. And I do have several friends and colleagues that have facilities around the area. So there's other areas I might have wanted to go to, but they were too close to my friends and colleagues, and I didn't want to jeopardize the relationship and do anything like that. So Barrington was an area where nobody else was there, and so forth. So I just basically kind of looked at where those demographics were relative to all the other high income areas, and this area fell right in the high end of the upscale, well-known areas around Chicago.
Great, awesome. Sorry, I know I interrupted you because you were talking about consumer behavior. I think you were kind of going on. You didn't really have as well established as your other studio. Maybe that was leading into what you're seeing from a consumer perspective.
Right. So the one issue is, obviously I'm just completely new trying to start a business from scratch, and it's just hard to get established. But the other thing that obviously that we are dealing with is the fact that people are not as comfortable of going out and going to public places in general, but fitness centers and so forth. And even though, as you noted, I market my business, I mean, literally at this point, I'm the only employee, I'm the only trainer. So when somebody is with me, they are literally the only person in the room exercising at that time. And I even try to stagger my appointments with the clients so that they don't even come into contact with any other people. They come in, do their workout, and leave before the next client gets there. So it is obviously the best possible world for somebody to go in and exercise. I mean, the only person they're having contact with is me. And we practice, safety distances and so forth, or social distancing. So in that regard, anybody that experiences this or gets far enough to talk to me about it or come in and check it out, they're going to be able to see that it's a very safe environment, a very, extremely low volume thing. But I think just to some degree, people maybe aren't considering it as much because of the fear factor. And it's been so overwhelming. I mean, I know, constant 24/7 on the news, every single case count, every single fatality, worry about the new variants and everything. And it's like every time you turn around, it's this fear mongering about every little tiny thing that happens with COVID. So I think that's definitely weighed on people. And where I wouldn't have maybe had as difficult of time if I was already established and had 100 clients or whatever more, and they were all committed to the program, that would be different getting them back in, because they know me, they trust me, they know the environment, they would come back. But starting with people that have never met me, don't know anything about me, that's maybe a little more difficult.
And also your previous clients would have had a way better education on the benefits of strength training too, right? Because you're educating them all the time. And so they, if anything, you may have seen an even stronger return to studio, perhaps the opposite effect if you were in the last place, just because people would be like, hey, I need to improve my immune system and improve my health. Potentially, of course.
That's exactly what I've seen with some of my friends, where they are back to higher than, they're actually higher than pre-COVID levels in terms of their clientele.
Yeah. I've seen the same. Yeah.
Basically, by what you just said, that people understand the value of this now.
Yeah. So. Awesome. All right, Tim. So I want to get into a bit of a business profile with you now in the new business. I'd love to learn a little bit more about the training method, session length, equipment, things like that, so that the audience get an idea of kind of offering you have at your existing business.
Yeah. So obviously, philosophically wise, training protocol and methodology, we are solid, high intensity training, coming up through, my background with the Nautilus method and Arthur Jones and Ellington Darden and, all of those people. I mean, I've always been solid, high intensity training along those lines. Obviously, with my background, I had a considerable amount of experience with the super slow method and was very into that. And I would say at this point, I don't, practice a full-on strict super slow in terms of the 10-second, protocol, but obviously emphasizing a very slow motion methodology. I would say more along the lines of maybe a 5-second positive contraction and a 5-second negative. I do have some people that actually had done super slow before coming to me, so they've come in and they're still doing like a 10-10 protocol or whatever. So definitely emphasizing extremely slow motion, safe movement speeds, very strict attention to turnaround points and not using momentum, pausing in a contracted position, things of that nature. And of course, the high intensity, going through and training to, momentary muscular failure. So in terms of what I recommend per week, usually I'm recommending people train twice per week. And, I obviously fully aware that advanced subjects and people that are training very intensely and very skilled, maybe twice a week is too much for them. But the average person, the average client walking through the door, the universal problem is more a matter of insufficient intensity, trying to get them to work hard enough and to tolerate the work and the fatigue and the muscle burn. So with the average person, I feel they can tolerate twice per week. And it's also one of those things that you want them to be able to have enough exposure to them to keep them in sort of the fitness mindset or the fitness lifestyle and doing their exercise, eating right, having those checks and balances of meeting with me. And I feel that sometimes if people just train once a week and then just forget about all this the other 6 days of the week, they don't necessarily get all those lifestyle factors in place like they should. So.
Yeah. And session length is 30 minutes. That's right.
Yeah, session length, 30 minutes.
And I love you've got 3 packages I saw on the site, one of which you have once a week, twice a week, but then you have the 3 sessions per 2-week period, which I thought was very clever, right? So people don't necessarily want to train twice a week because maybe they want more recovery or just their lifestyle doesn't allow it. Then you can cater for that individual who wants more frequency than just once a week.
Yeah, and that's exactly why I did it, because you do have a situation where let's say you have a client that starts out at twice a week and they happen to be one of these people over time that do become very proficient at this and are willing to work hard, and they're assertive and they're willing to do what it takes, and they become a real good client. So with them, twice a week is going to become too frequent and maybe they're not going to recover from it. But maybe they're not quite ready for once a week. So in that case, again, I'm going to offer that program where typically what works best in this regard is maybe they train Monday and Friday on week 1, and then just Wednesday of week 2. And then the 3rd week, they're back to Monday and Friday, and the 4th week, Wednesday. So what ends up being is they're training every 4th or 5th day. So getting 4 to 5 days of recovery in there, and again, that's kind of a real good approach, and I find that that works well.
Very good, very good. And in terms of equipment, talk to us about that. What you have in place, what you've adjusted and retrofitted.
Yeah. So when I went to do this new facility, in my old facility, I had a lot of MedX equipment and I had a lot of 1st and 2nd generation Nautilus equipment that I had extensively modified and retrofitted and refurbished and all of that kind of stuff. And obviously it was outstanding and I was very happy with that equipment. As I looked to start this new facility, there was 2 things on my mind. One is that I had always loved the MedX Avenger machines, the plate loading machines. I did have the Avenger leg press in my old facility and thought that it's one of the best machines ever built. So I really loved the Avenger, and I had always wanted to have a line of Avenger machines because it extreme heavy duty, very solid, sturdy machines, extremely low friction. Very well designed, and I also felt that a lot of the Avenger machines didn't need retrofitting. They were machines that I could drop in place and use as is. So I didn't want to try to open this facility and spend countless hours breaking down equipment and modifying things and running back and forth to the machine shop, getting things fabricated and built and repainted and all that. So the Avenger machines were attractive to me because not only were they awesome, they could be dropped in place without much need for modification. So I did a lot of work finding some used Avenger machines and ended up with about nine different machines there. I also was fortunate enough to find real good deals on two MedX medical machines, the medical lumbar extension and the medical cervical extension that were just like a can't beat price kind of thing. So I picked up those. I've added to that a couple other MedX selectorized machines, the rotary torso and the abdominal. And then I've supplemented with a few different Nautilus machines, even a couple hammer strength machines. So I've got a pretty good lineup now of about 21 different machines and a couple more things that I'd like to add, but very happy with the choices, and it's been great.
I'm very jealous. Because we'll get onto the MedX leg press next, but in the video tutorial, obviously you demo the Avenger MedX leg press, and I have seen it before. I don't think I've used it, but it just looks like a really nice piece, and it looks really easy to modify in terms of like changing load and changing the range of motion. It seems it's much easier to do it without being obstructive to the client, because obviously changing the load and trying to gap a machine on the other MedX leg press with the weight stacks is far more kind of invasive. So that was really immediately clear to me when I was watching your video. So thank you for that. It's great to get an overview of your business. I could probably just talk about that for the rest of this entire podcast, but I know we want to talk about the leg press. So I thought, just to kick things off, firstly, for everyone listening to this, please go to highintensitybusiness.com, go to episode 303 and watch the video tutorial from Tim. It's amazing. He does an entire tutorial on how to use the MedX Avenger leg press. The same principles, the way I understand it, the same principles can be applied to any MedX leg press. And it's just a really good overview of the details of how you operate this machine with clients. And it's just I learned so much. I took so many notes. But for those listening and who perhaps want to just get a quick overview before they watch the video, Tim, can you just give a quick kind of high-level tutorial? When I say quick, I mean, we can take 20 minutes or however long you think is necessary, but just a high-level view on how you use this piece with your clients.
Yeah, so I think probably a good place to start is, number one, the MedX leg press, whether it's the selectorized version or the Avenger version, are basically, in my opinion, the two best leg presses ever built and available. They are outstanding pieces. They do an excellent job of, in the biomechanical area, tracking muscle and joint function and really patterning the movement off of the natural, body movements. Tremendous amount of adjustments and adaptability for various people. Obviously low friction and very smooth, and they're outstanding pieces. And as you noted, all the things that somebody can watch in the video that I supply, the instructional, everything equally applies to the MedX selectorized weight stack version as it does to the Avenger version, with the one exception being that on the selectorized version, you are pinning off or gapping the weight stack to adjust the starting range of motion. Whereas on the Avenger, you've got sort of a lever bar that the movement arm will rest on, and it can swing out of the way and allow different ranges of motion. So other than that gapping of the weight stack on the selectorized, everything they'll see in the video is applicable to both machines. Okay. And, with that in mind, obviously the leg press is going to be one of the, the star of the workout. It's going to be probably the most important exercise by virtue of the fact that it trains nearly the whole lower body, and it trains the largest muscle groups in the body, and obviously muscle groups that are extremely important and functional as well. So the leg press is always sort of the cornerstone of the workout, so it's something that's obviously always involved in somebody's routine. And with the routines, I mean, obviously I don't have people do the leg press every single workout. I do alternate it with the leg extension and some of the other leg and hip exercises, so that's all factored in. But the leg press is critical. So everybody uses it, and pretty much everybody hates to do it, because it is so hard, it is demanding, and not only is it very uncomfortable with the muscle burn and so forth that you experience, but obviously the whole systemic effect of the cardiovascular system and the breathing rate and body temperature rises and everything.
Can I make a quick confession to you, Tim? I've had as you know, I've had the MedX leg press in our studio here for a few months. I can honestly say I have not gone to true momentary muscular failure on that machine yet. Just haven't had it. I reckon I've been maybe a bit one rep in me every single time, because I know when I've got there. I used to be able to get there consistently when I did. I followed Body by Science very strictly back in the day, maybe almost 10 years ago, when I trained at Kiza, which was obviously the global training franchise. And I would do like big free quite a lot. So I would just do like pull down, chest press, leg press. And because I was doing, I guess, well, at least I felt this was true at the time, low volume, I could really bring it on the leg press. Or it was less about that, but more about, I had this view that this is my one chance this week, or this, whatever it was, every 10 days I was training, something like that. I have to get to failure. If I don't get to failure, it's wasted, which I don't really necessarily believe that now. But back then I was so kind of, let's say, religious about that almost. And I would get to absolute utter failure, almost every single time. Whereas, I'm still trying to get back to that level.
Yeah, no, it's that exercise is a real character builder, I would say. And it takes every ounce of your concentration to really do it right and, fully apply yourself to it. And it's always been one of those things, like when I, personally, when I'm training and I go to get into that exercise, as I'm about to start my first rep, there's a moment of just thinking, oh boy, here it comes. It's like one of these things that I know that once I start that, there's no turning back, and a very healthy respect that I'm about to do something that's extremely, difficult and demanding. And, what's great about all of this high intensity training, but particularly the leg press, is it makes you stronger, obviously physically, but it makes you stronger mentally. Okay. Because when you learn to endure, the effort and the discomfort the discomfort that you're getting through this training, it hardens you, it gives you, builds you a higher pain tolerance, it gives you more mental discipline. And I think it pays off in other areas of life, way beyond, physical ability and performance, but just mental ability and discipline and 100%. Pain tolerance and those things. So,
yeah. So sorry, I interrupted your flow as you were giving the tutorial there. I think you were going through, talking about the trepidation that people feel starting the leg press. Do you want to kind of resume from there and go into like how you would instruct and manage settings and things like that?
Yeah. So first off, it's probably good to discuss one point, and that is when we talk about this idea of enduring or tolerating, disciplining ourselves to train to failure and to, put up with the discomfort that experience and so forth. But the training in general, I feel there's two types of, real effort and motivation and discipline that you have to put into this. And one would be while you're training and as your muscles are gradually fatiguing and as you're getting closer to failure, sort of putting up with that burn and that discomfort and pushing through it and trying to continue to a true muscle failure where you're not stopping because you don't want any more of this. You're stopping because you literally have no, enough physical strength left to complete the next rep, despite your best efforts. But the other thing that people have to learn to do is they have to be willing to engage in a heavy weight load from the get-go. For various reasons, and I know this isn't the topic of today's discussion, but we do need to reach failure within a reasonable window of time. We should not be on a machine 3 or 4 minutes or something like that trying to reach failure. Somewhere in the maybe 1 to 2 minute window, ideally maybe more between 45 and 90 seconds depending on rep cadence or whatever. But even if we just say somewhere within 1 to 2 minutes, you should be achieving failure. A weight load that's going to cause failure in that time frame, especially if you're training with a fairly slow repetition speed cadence, that weight's going to feel heavy very quickly. Okay, so you've got to be willing to go there in the first place. You've got to be willing to get in and engage a heavy enough load that's going to challenge you and bring you to failure within that ideal time frame. And I think what happens is people get in an exercise and they feel that they should just be able to very easily push that first rep out. And they feel like they should have several relatively easy reps where they can, get comfortable with that. So what happens is if they're training with a weight load that feels easy at first and they can do several relatively easy reps, that weight is not going to bring them to failure within a reasonable time frame. So what happens is when you give them the load that is going to bring them to failure in that time frame, when they initially push into that for that first rep, they don't have the confidence or they don't have the wherewithal to dig in and contract at a deeper, higher level and overcome that weight load. So they consequently think it's too heavy. And they, have resistance to be, to train with that weight load. So you have to overcome that too. And the reason I bring that up is that that symptom or whatever you might want to call it, that people have, that is most pronounced on the leg press, because the leg press is the exercise you're going to be training with the highest weight load, because you're dealing with your largest, strongest muscles in the body. So you have the most strength and the most ability, and you're going to have to train with a weight that's going to match that. So you have a situation where, we know that in physics, there's I don't know the word to describe it, but this idea of the inertia, okay, that an object is going to tend to continue to do what it's doing. So if an object is in motion, it's going to be tending towards staying in motion unless acted against by an outside force. And an object that's not in motion is going to tend to stay not in motion unless acted upon by an outside force. So if you think about that principle, when somebody begins to start that first rep, it's actually somewhat harder to start the weight into motion than it is to keep it in motion once it's already moving, okay? And that's true regardless of, speed of motion. That's most pronounced in the leg press. So getting that weight load and initiating it and getting it moving in the first place is difficult. But once it's in motion and now you keep it moving, there's another factor there, and that's sort of neurologically your body getting primed and sort of turned on and those muscle fibers activated to go from a complete dead rest and then get that weight in motion. It takes a little bit to sort of ramp up and get that machinery going, okay? So that's most pronounced in the leg press. So one of the things I think Luke mentioned in his video was the idea of helping the person start that first rep, okay? And pushing the movement out, having the trainer sort of assist in pushing the movement arm out that first time. so that the client can sort of get that in motion, okay, and get the confidence that they can handle that load. It's a little more difficult to do that on the leg press or the selectorized leg press, because there's not a lot of room to access that movement arm and not interfere with the client. The Avenger is very simple to give that initial assist, because you've got that big lever arm that the weights rest on, particularly that rear lever arm with the weight horn on it. It's very easy to stand behind the subject and just give a little assist on that weight horn to help that first rep get started. That's a very handy option.
That's a great piece of advice. I was hoping you would mention Luke's what Luke does on that, because it tied in perfectly with what you were saying. I mean, it sounds ridiculous, but like, you're absolutely right about the law of physics you mentioned there, and that makes a lot of sense to me. I forget a lot about that stuff I learned at school, but it's very relevant with these machines. And I think one of the things Luke says that they do at DS is they have the trainer pull the plate from the front of the machine. Now, I still don't quite get how they do that. And I think the reason I don't fully understand is because our machine is too close to the wall for me to actually do that. So I perhaps need to play around with that in the future. But what I do at the moment, and I think I picked this up from Logan, one of Luke's trainers, is I just assist with the first rep with my foot from the side. And I find that works perfectly well. And I do think it makes a huge difference, based on what you said.
Yeah, and you do bring up a good point with, depending on how your machine is positioned, if it is facing right into a wall, you might not have a lot of room to get out in front and do that. The idea of doing it with your leg is an option. Obviously, this is one of those things that, depending on the load that a client is using, it may, as it gets heavier, it's harder for you to assist. But remember, you're not having to lift the entire load. The client is helping you too. So you're just having to give enough assist to sort of break that inertia and get the process moving. The other, aspect is that you can have the client assist by putting their hands on their knees and sort of pushing with their legs and pushing with their hands on their knees to kind of push that out. And that's personally, a lot of times I train without somebody else. I'm just by myself when I train. So the only way that I can help myself get the first rep started is to push on my knees and give that an assist with my legs and get that first rep out there. So you could try things like that as well. Of course, it only applies for the first rep. You don't want the client using their hands on their knees for other reps. So.
Yeah, no, exactly. I'm thinking, as you're saying this, I'm thinking probably a lot of the, I guess, remaining tutorials in the video. But do you want to just touch on, I guess, some of the key things you think are important about using the MedX leg press, key kind of pointers or tips that the listeners might find useful, in addition to what you've already said?
Yeah. Well, I probably the biggest thing I want to make sure we get into this video or this podcast here is the notion of, and this is maybe one of the differences that I had with Luke, and that is that many people do not use the machine properly in terms of the setup. And let me kind of take a step back and explain what I'm talking about. And that is that the way this machine is designed, and also if you compare the design of the machine to the actual biomechanical movement pattern that the body goes through as these muscles and joints interact in this exercise, there's this idea of, as you imagine yourself sitting in the leg press with your feet on the platform, and as if the machine were not there, you're just in that position, you're seated in a seat with your feet out in that position, and as you push out and contract the glutes, the hamstrings, the quadriceps, and these muscles and the hip and the knee joint and the ankle joints interact, that movement pattern produced by those muscle groups and those joint actions is going to be a forward, downward arcing movement, okay? And the MedX does an awesome job of actually tracking that movement and providing resistance directly opposed to that movement. So in other words, the movement of the machine, that foot platform is going forward and arcing downward and extending forward as your body is doing the same thing. There's a very synchronistic match between the human body and its movement and this machine in that case. And that's one of the reasons why this is such a well-designed leg press. So the way this is designed to maximally optimize matching the body's movements and the range of motion that it would undergo during this movement is that you want that movement arm on the machine to go all the way down and out and forward until it rests against the bumpers on the front end of the machine. Where literally you want that movement arm to go as far forward as it can until it hits the end stops of the machine and cannot go any farther. And when you set up the exercise and you set the subject in the exercise to accomplish that, you have a nearly perfect match biomechanically between the body's movement and the machine's movement, okay? If you don't set it up that way, and you have the person, positioned differently, what happens is you will not optimize that biomechanical movement pattern. You'll have the body trying to go through this downward arc, but you'll have the movement arm in a position that it's mostly just going forward and slightly downward, and it's not as good of a match. And consequently, an improper setup, you're going to lose a lot of hip extension range of motion. I've never measured it, but by my estimation, you might lose 30 degrees range of motion around the hips if you don't set the machine up correctly. And you'll also lose some of the directness of the resistance being applied to those muscles because your body's trying to kind of move in one way and the machine's kind of at a different position moving in a slightly different way. So the optimal synchronization between human and machine in this case is going to be setting up the exercise so that when your legs are extended, when you hit the point where you're just short of lockout on your knee, that movement arm is resting against the end stops or the bumpers that it will hit, okay? Now, my biggest pet peeve with this machine is every single time I see somebody use this exercise, almost, and when I see videos on the internet, almost nobody sets up the machine to do this, okay? Most people will not gap the weight stack. They'll leave the weight stack fully bottomed out. They'll just push the subject in until they're in a position where their thighs are up into their chest and so forth. And then as they push out and extend the movement arm, it only goes through about half of its range of motion and is not really into that downward arcing phase, okay? So to set it up right and to get the person positioned correctly, you're going to have to gap the weight stack. You're going to have to pin that movement arm forward so that foot platform is starting a little more forward, and that allows the subject to get positioned more closely into the machine so that when their legs extend, they're going to be able to hit that end point, okay? And I think, probably the reason people don't use it correctly, there could be several reasons. One may be they simply have never been taught how to use a machine correctly. They're just sort of innocently ignorant of the proper use of the machine, never been taught. Another factor may simply be that I think it's kind of laziness in a way, that they don't want to spend the time learning the intricacies of the proper setup of the exercise. They don't want to spend the time gapping the weight stack and trying to really study and get that person positioned correctly. People will be able to see on the video, instructional video that I provided, that it does take a fair amount of time. I mean, it's going to go very quickly once the trainer becomes efficient at determining these things. It literally doesn't take that long at all. But I think people want to just throw somebody in a machine and push the seat in and tell them to go, and they don't want to spend all this time, detailing the seat setting. The other thing you have too is that with the proper seating arrangement, I alluded to this on the video, that it may change slightly over time, because you may be able to get that person positioned correctly at one weight load, But over time, several months, as they get stronger, the compression of the seat padding and their position changes slightly, and you've got to counteract that by adjusting the seat a little bit. And so you do open up some issues there.
Yeah, 100% on that point. I've noticed that myself. Like, I was having one of our trainers train me yesterday, and I'm like, these settings aren't right. And I'm like, have you put the settings right on the sheet? And she's like, yeah, I'll put the settings right. I'm like, this is not right. And so we ended up changing something. I think we changed the gap or something like that. And when I watched your video, I was like, well, of course it changes. If the load changes, if you start curling up out of the seat because of the sheer force of the load, or any other reason, it is going to change those settings, albeit probably quite small changes over time, which is something I hadn't even thought about. I thought the settings would stay as they are, obviously depending on whether you're upright, middle, or squat. But yeah, that was a bit of an aha moment for me.
Right, and there's a couple things that can slightly alter your setting. Is it number one? When you're sitting in the seat and you're completely relaxed and there's no load on you, you're not really in the same position that you're going to be in when you push the weight out and the load's upon you, and the forces are sort of pushing you into the seat. Okay, so number one, that first rep that you perform, as you get out to that end point, the person needs to kind of get set in the seat and get their body pressed up into place, get their hips set, get their shoulders up to the shoulder pads and whatnot. And you sort of need to get set on that first rep. Okay. So that's number one. But then those same factors, as the weight gets heavier, it tends to compress you in the seat more and change it slightly. So generally the corrective is to, once you see that either those knees are starting to lock out or become too straightened at the end point, or perhaps you start not quite reaching the end point anymore, then you want to bring the seat a notch closer for the subject to move forward. And occasionally when that happens, depending at what point in the process you decide to move them forward, sometimes you move the seat forward a notch. It corrects the problem, but maybe the seat feels like it's a little too far forward. And that's where you can go, again, referring to the video, where you can go and kind of, through a combination of maybe adjusting the shoulder pad height along with the seat position, you can get the corrective to kind of dial in those settings a little better. So.
Yeah, that's awesome. And just to, I guess, summarize some of what you said, what you said makes a lot of sense in terms of why you would gap the machine, the match between the body's biomechanics and the intended strength curve of the machine. And I had a bit of a light bulb moment when you said that, because I thought, yeah, you know what, I think that's what I will intend to do going forward. Because I'll admit, we have a mix. We have some that gap and some that don't. And honestly, I would agree with you. Part of that is probably laziness from my point of view, but also just a ignorance around the strength curve as well. I think another reason why some people don't do it is maybe they don't believe that there's any additional benefit by going through the full strength curve. Perhaps they're wrong about that, I'm not sure. And then it's also just speed, right? So if you're churning through clients, you've got lots of trainers, you just want to get, I guess, workouts done a bit faster, then I guess the first workout's going to take long, but after that, you should have the settings done where it shouldn't take you too long to get someone in that leg press gapped. But those are just some thoughts.
Right. I mean, once you've determined the settings and you've got them written down on a chart or whatnot, it's a very simple, quick setup procedure after that initial determination. So that's not really an issue. I do want to kind of maybe clarify a point, and you brought up the strength curve and whatnot. Obviously, to be most accurate, what we're talking about is body itself is what possesses a strength curve. That particular muscle is varying strengths along the range of motion and the different changing joint angles. So the body has a strength curve that we would call. The machine is providing a resistance curve. Okay, in other words, the machine's providing resistance to ideally match that strength curve. Okay. In the MedX leg press, the machine's resistance curve is going to be essentially the same regardless of how you set up the exercise. Okay, because it's sort of a linear ascending resistance curve. Okay. So that remains the same regardless of how you position the subject in there. But what's going to change is that the subject's positioning relative to the machine, there could be a little bit of a mismatch between the subject's strength curve because they're in a slightly different position relative to the machine. So there could be a mismatch there, but the biggest mismatch is more sort of geometrically or biomechanically in terms of the movement pattern. Again, that movement arm kind of forward and downward arcing along with the bodies, that those femurs, if you watch the movement from the side, particularly the femurs, thighs are articulating around the hip joint, and that bone is going forward and downward with an arc. Okay. So what I'm talking about is kind of having that bodily movement, geometrical pattern taking place, matching the machines, or the machine matching the body, whatnot, and that you're getting that synchronization between that movement pattern, and you're getting the full hip extension of the movement that the movement would allow. So,
yeah, thank you for clarifying that. Well, just articulating what I said much better in more accurate terms. And I think going back again, referencing the video you did, you do a great job of explaining the different positions of the knee and the ankle and the hip in terms of degrees, and just little reference points that people can use to figure out if they've got those things right with the client. So I thought that was really helpful. Let me see here. I think you've addressed the main difference that you had with Luke's podcast, which was really helpful. I just want to dig into some of that a little bit more. So let's talk about hyperextension for a moment, or lockout. I know that there's other reasons why you gap it, which you've already gone through, but I'm just very curious. Have you heard of clients locking out knees and having an acute injury, like a hyperextension related injury? Have you had that happen? Have you heard of that happening on a leg press or even on a MedX leg press?
Yeah. Well, thankfully, I can say it's never happened under my watch with any of my clients. And I've had clients on occasion lock their knees. Okay, because even when you set it up right and you're hitting that end point, and your knee is stopping short of lockout, if a subject wants to push the issue and force their knee to lock out, they can do it. Okay. Number one, there's a little bit of, flexibility in the bumper that you're resting the movement arm against. But again, going back to those seat pads compressing and stuff. So a person could force a knee lockout even when they're set properly in the machine. And sometimes they do that because, people want to try to get relief. They want to get the load off the muscles. They want to straighten out their legs and rest and, hold it with their bones. So that's happened. I've never had somebody actually injure themselves, but kind of funny, there are some YouTube videos out there of people in gyms, knuckleheads in gyms in various areas doing leg presses where they lock out and get severely injured, where they not only hyperextend, but their knees bend back the wrong way. And, it's really like you sickens your stomach when you see, and those are on leg presses that don't have any endpoint, so to speak. You're not hitting a bumper. You're not stopping at a defined endpoint. They're just going too far. They're just voluntarily extending so far and hyperextending their knees and getting injured. So that can happen. And it's one of the reasons why, as a trainer, not only am I trying to set up the machine to keep them partially loaded with a partially bent knee, as I'm training them and watching them, I'm very closely watching how far their knees are extended. And if I see, as the set's progressing and the client is starting to get a little panicky and I see them trying to maybe lock out, or I'm getting those early warning signs that they're about to try to lock out their knee, I get right out there and, number one, verbally remind them not to do that. But if a client's not behaving, I'll get out there and physically stop their knees from going too far. I'll just touch. Usually, I'll put my hand on the back of their knee and just kind of stop them. Because stop them from going into that extension. Now that's a rare event, but if I have to, between the verbal and the physical, get out there and make sure they don't lock out their knees.
That's so interesting. I do want to talk about, if we get the opportunity, talk about some of your coaching cues around that. Just going back to a knee lockout. So you said there about how there's some examples online of acute injuries happening, hyperextension of the knee, which sounds like something I do not want to watch. Sounds pretty horrifying.
Yeah.
Now, I've had people use a MedX leg press and lock out and report knee pain after that, right? So like the next day having knee pain, which obviously isn't ideal. So I'm wondering, even if someone doesn't hyperextend, if they lock out or if they lock out too frequently, is there chronic risk from that? Have you had that reported to you before?
Well, yeah. I mean, what you could be describing as something that's maybe not an actual physical injury, but enough of an irritation, to cause some discomfort. So, imagine that there's maybe some slight micro trauma that by that lockout, they've maybe stretched some ligaments or maybe put some compression on the meniscus of the knee or something like that. And they feel a little sensitivity to that. And like I say, they're not necessarily full on injured, but they did enough to kind of irritate the tissues there that they're feeling it. Okay. And yeah, I suppose just like anything else, if they're chronically doing that, okay, they could get to the point where they, maybe could cause a meniscal tear or something slightly, or just wear some wear and tear on the knee joint. So yeah, it would be something you definitely don't want to chronically allow to happen. One of the things, there's a difference. Let's say you've using a leg press where there's no defined endpoint and you're just extending your knees out and you're having to voluntarily stop at whatever position to avoid the lockout. When you go into a too far of an extension or a hyperextension under those conditions, it's obviously bad and you've got the load and you could injure your knee. But then when you do it with a defined endpoint, let's say you push out, you hit a defined endpoint, and then you continue to push and try to force a knee lockout against that defined endpoint, you probably are putting yourself in an even more vulnerable position because you've got the load, but you're forcing against that fixed endpoint too.
Yeah, and so it's almost like pushing back on you, kind of, which is the increased risk. One of the other things you said, which I'm trying to understand better, is you talk about people who can use a MedX leg press and almost be able to use the entire weight stack. And I've been able to do that. Now, again, was I using it correctly? Probably not. This was way back. Now I'm using a lot less and trying to train a lot more safely and effectively. Can you talk about why is it that, in your view, some people use the entire weight stack? You think that's probably because they're not using it correctly? And why is it, if you're using it in the way that you talk about it, that you shouldn't be able to use, well, in your words, about approximately half the full weight stack? I guess I'm talking about a selectorized piece in this context.
Yeah, I think there's a couple things at play there. One would be, recall that the machine's resistance curve is sort of a linear ascending, meaning that the resistance is lightest at the bottom when your legs are up into your chest, let's say, okay? And it's heaviest when the movement arm is extended all the way forward and your knees are extended forward. And you've got this linear progressive incline, okay? So when you set it up the way I'm describing and you gap the weight stack and you push the person farther in, you're essentially starting higher on that resistance curve and using the upper half of the resistance curve. So there's more load on you, regardless of what the weight stack is saying, there's more load on you by value of that resistance curve, okay? When you don't gap the weight stack, you're training in the bottom half of the resistance curve and using essentially less resistance regardless of what the weight stack is saying. So that's one aspect. The other aspect, I think, that when you're sort of mismatching, again, your body's strength curve with the resistance curve, and you're also the movement pattern, the geometry is not the same, and I think the body is moving through a more advantaged position when you're not set up in the machine correctly. So by those two factors, people can lift a lot more weight on the weight stack, and that may feed their ego, but essentially they're not really exposing themselves to more weight. They're just sort of cheating the system a little bit. So I would say my personal experience with the machine set up the way I described, I've never seen somebody use more than about 800 pounds, which would be 400 pounds on each weight stack. Okay. The standard MedX selectorized machine is essentially 1,000-pound weight stack, 500 on each side. Okay. Now that's somewhat deceptive because the MedX machines are engineered to have a short stroke on the weight stack, meaning that the gearing ratio, so to speak, regardless of how far the body range of motion is, the weight stack moves about a foot. Okay. And when you're gapping the weight stack, maybe somewhat less. So when you factor in the work ratio, a typical, some other brand of equipment or a typical Nautilus machine, a lot of times the weight stack would move 18 to 24 inches, 1.5 to 2 feet, where the MedX is geared to sort of move 1 foot. Okay, so that allows you to lift more weight, but there's kind of a lower momentum inertia factor in the exercise and helps with friction as well. So at any rate, regardless of the numbers on the weight stack, I've never seen somebody properly set up use more than about 800 pounds, which means you've got a 200-pound leeway that you've still got access to. Okay, and that was a very strong, motivated, well-trained subject. Okay, now on the flip side, I've seen relative beginners or just semi-strong people use close to the whole weight stack or the whole weight stack when they're not set up correctly. And then you hear people on the internet complaining, oh, this machine doesn't have as much weight, and I always think to myself, yeah, set it up right and we'll see what you have to say about that. So, but even if somebody, wanted to, MedX does sell their selectorized weight stack with 2 600-pound weight stacks, which gives you 1,200 pounds. And I would say anybody short of, professional football player or something is probably not going to train with more than that properly set up.
Yeah, it's just so fascinating because I did gap one client from the get-go because he had a really bad habit of locking his knees. So I guess what I have been doing with those that weren't gapped is I've been pretty good, I think, at coaching them not to lock their knees, and I've seen massive improvement in that. But that obviously doesn't fix some of the other issues you mentioned about not gapping the machine. But this one client who were gapping from the get-go, very beginner, has a lot of progress to make in his leg strength, and even with a light load, but because I feel like he's in the right position in that seat, he's gapped correctly, he's not locking out. He finds that load. I mean, we're talking, I think it's like 160 pounds on each leg, finds that load incredibly challenging. And it surprises me, but then it's going to be harder because he is, in the more difficult range of motion on that machine, or the correct range of motion in your view, right? So it's interesting. It's the load does change quite significantly. I mean, I use about, I want to say like 300. I can't even remember actually. I think I use around 300 and something, and that's with gapped and upright. However, there's probably changes I could make, thinking about it now, that would make that load more challenging for me, and that it more difficult and actually require me to reduce that load. But yeah, so I'll definitely be looking at the way I use the machine going forward. Go ahead. You have any thoughts on that? Or?
Yeah, I think just one other thing to add there, besides these setup procedures we've been talking about, even allowing a subject like let's say even if you gap the weight stack and you get the movement arm pretty far out there and pretty close to touching the end point, but maybe there's an inch gap that you could still, get them farther forward, but leaving them a little bit away from the end point, that makes it somewhat easier. But even with everything set up properly, one thing, if a person just goes a little too far, let's say they're essentially hitting the end point, but their knees are just getting too straight. They're not hyperextended, they're not locked out, but they're pretty straight. They're still touching the end point. The machine is set up right, but just getting a little bit too much knee extension, I think people fail to appreciate how much relief from the load you get when your legs become nearly straight. Okay. Arthur Jones famously said one time that, and he was talking about this when he was discussing the design of the Nautilus Duo squat machine, which had a very aggressive cam, negative cam that really increased the load as you extended your legs. But he was talking that, from a mechanical perspective, that when a subject gets their knees nearly straight, okay, they've got such a tremendous leverage advantage that theoretically they could lift the weight of the world at that position if the bones could support it. Okay. In other words, muscularly speaking, you're at such an advantage when your legs are nearly straight that, and this is not in a knee leg extension machine, but in a leg press or squat or something, you're at such a mechanical advantage at that point that the muscles would be capable of lifting the weight of the world if the bones could support it. Okay. The only thing being is that obviously the weight of the world would crush your bones or whatever. But if you keep that kind of concept in mind, and even with Arthur's, exaggerated descriptions sometimes, the point is that when your legs are getting straighter and straighter and virtually near that lockout point, you're gaining a tremendous leverage advantage. And that means that you're not receiving as much resistance as you could handle. Okay. So you are getting a bit of a rest in that position. Okay. So if you allow subjects to either get too far extended, a little too straight, if you allow them to sit out there and linger in that extended position, they're essentially resting between repetitions. And I've seen situations where if that's been allowed to happen and you correct that, either by slightly adjusting the seat or just making them turn around and not linger out there, I've seen people have to drop 50 pounds or something off the weight in order to now accommodate it, because taking away that rest point, they're suddenly fatiguing much quicker, making the exercise harder.
That's exactly what I'm doing wrong. I feel quite confident about that. So we'll see. I think I'm back at it on probably Sunday or Monday. So I'll give it a go and try that out. Tim, just a couple more questions before we wrap up. In terms of progression, I've been playing around with microloading people for various reasons. I think it's useful for seeing, I guess, a more linear progression, having more opportunities to show the client progression. So from a customer retention adherence point of view, we all know that the load doesn't matter as much. Well, I'm not sure if you agree with this, but load doesn't seem to matter as much as we thought it did in terms of producing, muscular adaptations. It seems like training with high level of intensity or train to failure is the key thing. However, obviously you want to be able to do so within a certain time frame so that you're not recovering and recruiting those higher order motor units. Where was I going with this? Progression, asset microloading. And so obviously choosing a load that someone's still going to find it very challenging. And even if someone reports, let's say let's say I'm using an 8 to 12 rep range, 2-4 cadence, something like that. If someone hits, say, 8 reps at a given load, I'll almost always increase that load by 2 pounds next time and see the same, if not an improvement in performance. So that's my own way of doing it. And obviously you can do that quite easily with all of these selectorized MedX machines. I'd love to hear how you progress clients on the Avenger leg press, or the one I've got as well. Maybe it's the same. I'm just curious.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I feel progression's obviously very important, and you're constantly striving to see some sort of progress and improvements, whether it be, increases in their load time before they reach failure, or increases in the actual weight load that you're placing on the machine. Obviously, we all know that there's various ways of, increasing the intensity and various techniques to influence the rate of fatigue and, place more emphasis on different things. So it does get to be kind of a gray area. It's not as cut and dried that just because you lifted more weight on the machine that somehow you made legitimate progress. Because if your technique changes, if you, in the case we're talking about, if you linger at that near lockout point or go too far with your knees, there's all sorts of variables that can influence, what your perceived performance is. But regardless of those things, if we're just talking about progression, I do feel it's important to make progress as long as you're keeping the form strict and you're not getting progressively more cheating going on as you train with heavier loads. So that's something to consider. So one of the things with the progression is, obviously in the early stages, people are going to jump up weight load quicker because their rate of progress is more, their learning curve, their neurological changes that are happening, everything's going to ramp up quicker. Not to mention the fact you're normally starting a subject at lighter loads and teaching them the form and that. So some of the progression is simply just ramping them up into those weight loads that they can handle. So as things get more advanced, you are going to have a slower rate of progress and slower changes in the amount of weight loads that you can add as a person goes through. So what's nice, obviously, with the MedX machines, they go up by 2-pound increments, which 2 pounds on a MedX machine is probably the equivalent of adding 4 pounds to, say a Nautilus machine or a Cybex or Life Fitness or something, due to that shorter stroke on the weight stack we discussed. So 2 pounds, particularly on the leg press, most people probably wouldn't even feel a 2-pound increase on the MedX leg press. It's pretty slight, okay? So you've got the ability to micro load if you want to, and in a manner of thinking on this, if you add a slight bit of weight every time they train, and you add such a slight weight that they hardly notice it, theoretically you would think you could keep adding forever, right? Because just those slight little micro loads that somebody hardly notices and doesn't affect their performance, you would think you'd just keep adding. But eventually you get to the point where you're not always going to be able to add weight, or you start getting too aggressive with the weight loads that the subject starts misbehaving and things like that. So I think it's great to, usually what I'll do, to get more specific, is my personal rule of thumb on virtually any exercise is I never let a client go beyond 2 minutes total time under load, okay? If they do reach 2 minutes and they're not at failure, I just end the set and I'll make adjustments for next time, okay? But if they are reaching failure, and let's say they're reaching failure at about 2 minutes or wherever along the continuum, I'll use that to determine how much weight I'm going to add. So if they're getting to 2 minutes and they have not achieved failure, I'm going to be more aggressive about adding weight to that. So depending on the person, depending on how long they've been training, depending on my perception of how close to failure they were or were not, on the leg press, I might raise it 10 pounds or something, or maybe, 20 pounds, if they're really just not working very hard and they were nowhere near failure. But as they get closer to failure, I'm going to add less on each successive workout. Also, let's say they train to a minute 30 and they hit failure at a minute 30. Okay, I may just add 2 pounds in that case, because now I've got them failing in the range that I want them. I don't want to add too much weight and have them suddenly be so effective that, they're maybe less than a minute the next time. But I also don't want them, if they failed in a minute 30 one time, I don't want that creeping up towards the 2 minute mark. So maybe I'm just going to add a little bit of weight to keep them in that 130 range or slightly below. So it is somewhat of a subjective judgment call, and it's just using your expertise as a trainer to judge what their time under load is, how close to failure they were, or if they did reach failure, what that time was, and then knowing your equipment and knowing, what those weight increases reflect as you add that.
Yeah, that was great. Thank you for that, Tim. We're going to need to start wrapping up. We're coming towards the end of our time we have together here today. Unfortunately, I could probably talk to you about this and many other things all
time
day
goes
long.
Quick. I feel like we just sat down.
I agree. I'm glad you feel that way. What's the best way for listeners to find out more about you these days? What's the website, etc.?
Well, my personal training business website is stronglifetraining.com. So there's access. I mean, obviously all my phone number and every information and email address and all that is accessible through the website. So I would say that's probably the best way, is to just visit the website and get the contact information from there. And people are welcome to call me. They could email me, whatever. And that's probably the best bet.
Careful what you wish for.
Yeah, I know.
And you've just reminded me, I need to go back to our old episode and update the website link there, because it's still Precision Fitness from the last business.
Yeah, right.
So I'll get that updated. Who knows, maybe give you some link juice to the new website, maybe help with some SEO ranking. Probably not much, but you might get a little bit from me, since my site's perhaps a little bit older.
Yeah.
And just to reiterate, Tim was so generous in taking the time to do an amazing video tutorial on the MedX Avenger leg press, going through much more than what we talked about today in terms of the settings, pretty much every detail you need to think about when training a client. That will be available on the website, so highintensitybusiness.com, episode 303, but it'll also be available on all the other platforms that I am present. So it will be on YouTube, so High Intensity Business on YouTube. You can go to Facebook. You can find me on Facebook, so Lawrence Neal on Facebook, or High Intensity Business Facebook page. Where else will it be? Those are probably the only places, actually. Yeah. So check that out. That'll be enormously helpful to you. And to find the blog post for this episode and download free resources to help you grow your high intensity training business, please go to highintensitybusiness.com and search episode 303. Tim, thank you so much for doing this. Really appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
You're most welcome. And until next time, everyone listening, thank you very much. I'll talk to you soon.